Leader of the Opposition.
Mr President, on behalf of the Labor Opposition, I rise to associate our side of the chamber with the remarks made by the Leader of the Government in this place and many members of the other place as well, in paying tribute to the life and public service of the late Tom Lewis, former Premier of this state. And of course, the late Tom Lewis was not the only member of his family to have made a significant contribution to Australia. His great-grandfather had accompanied Charles Sturt on his 1844 trip to the interior, and his grandfather had established Bagot, Shakes and Lewis Limited, one of the colony's biggest pastoral firms. His father, Lancelot, was manager of the South Australian branch of Goldsborough Mort and Co, and his uncle, who raised him after the death of his father, was Essington Lewis, who headed BHP and established the Newcastle steelworks and was the wartime Director of Munitions. As the Leader of the Government indicated, Mr Lewis, on the outbreak of war, after some family discussion about whether he would stay to manage one of his uncle's farm, did join the 1st Armoured Division and later the 2nd and 3rd Company Commando Squadron, where he was commissioned as a lieutenant, and he saw active service in Java and Borneo. During the time of war, he met and married his first wife, an American journalist, and lived in New York. And through family connections, he met the Australian ambassador to Washington, a former Labor Minister, Norman Macon, and who gave him a job in the Australian Embassy, and where he stayed, living for about 5 years in Maryland. And on his return to Australia, he did buy a property at Castlereagh near Penrith, where he became a chicken farmer. And from there he went into Parliament as the member for Wallandilly during the 1957 by-election, and became a close associate of Robin Askin. And when the Askin government was elected to office in 1965, he became the Minister for Lands. And in that capacity, he oversaw quite significant reforms to the Lands Department, not all of which were well received by the public sector of the day, but nevertheless he was resolute in his work. And there was a newspaper editorial at the time which began, and I quote, "Dear Mr Lewis, we know a new broom sweeps clean, but please leave the closet," unquote. I think that was a reference to the thoroughness with which he undertook his task of reform of the lands portfolio. He had a keen interest in conservation, and as the Leader of the Government indicated, he was responsible for the establishment of the National Parks and Wildlife Service, and of course had a role with the modernisation of Taronga Zoo and the establishment of Western Plains Zoo at Dubbo. And it was well noted that he had a vision and a feel for conservation, which few of his colleagues shared. And I think it's to his very great credit that he undertook those roles. When Mr Askin indicated that he was leaving the position of Premier of the state, the Australian newspaper reported that Tom Lewis was, quote, "definitely interested, but he was a long shot." It's no secret that, of course, it was widely expected that the Deputy Premier at the time, Mr Willis, was the most likely person to succeed, but it was not how it turned out. As is often the way in politics, things can sneak up on people, but it didn't happen for absolutely no reason. And I'll quote one account, or at least partially, in the Rann biography by Mike Steckety and Milton Cockburn, and it said of Mr Lewis, quote, "His reputation was that of an able administrator. Certainly he was not generally talked of as a future party leader, but Lewis had another quality, and its force was underestimated. It was a personal charm. People liked him, and this was a factor which counted for a great deal in the parliamentary party." And of course it goes on to account many of his winning features of personality which secured him the premiership, although he didn't remain Premier for a very long time. He also had a contribution to the 1975 issue. It was his decision, I believe, perhaps the first captain's pick, to appoint in the place of the late Lionel Murphy QC, who left the Senate to become a High Court Justice, rather than following the convention of appointing a nominee of the party of the senator, the Premier determined to appoint the Mayor of Albury, Cleaver Bunton. And I think it was at least in part the controversy that arose from that might have caused his colleagues to reconsider the issue of the premiership. But nevertheless, that rounds out the picture of his contribution to public life in this state. And everyone in this chamber knows that serving the state, whether it's as a minister or a member of parliament or indeed as premier, takes a very significant toll on people and their families, and that's not to be underestimated. And we extend our condolences to Mr Lewis's widow Uta, his children and grandchildren, and we thank them for his contribution to public life in this state.